There was a big shift. It's debated exactly when this shift happened, but somewhere in the mid to late 2010s, the general perception of anime completely flipped on its head. In the 80s and 2000s, anime was largely seen as weird, nerdy, or far removed from Western animation and storytelling. But after this so-called shift, anime became entrenched in Western pop culture, and many people began to admire and celebrate the medium. There is largely still discussion of when the shift happened, some even denying it ever did occur, pointing to 90s anime being mainstream, but it becomes clear while looking at this graph, which shows 2014 being the start of a long incline in Western interest in the anime industry. Certain arguers suggest the amazing writing of Attack on Titan or the story and animation of Demon Slayer contributed to the shift and greater acceptance of anime. After watching Attack on Titan, my first anime, I was overjoyed to have the opportunity to indulge in a completely new and different medium. Though Attack on Titan remained firmly at the top of my list when I first watched it a few years ago, and is definitely still up there, watching other anime was still fun. Despite my newfound appreciation of the medium, many preconceived notions that I held against anime remained. The fan service, the weird animation style changes to try to be humorous, the female voice actors being unnecessarily high-pitched on purpose. Anime is still weird. And that's not just to say it's different from Western media, it really is weird. While its uniqueness to Western culture is praised, sometimes it seems like its uniqueness is mistaken for superiority against other media. Because these stories are so different from Western media, they seem particularly appealing and unique. All those years ago after I watched Attack on Titan, I looked for other anime to watch. Reading reviews of an anime and then proceeding to watch it right after made me notice a recurring pattern. I've been watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure recently. I've only watched up to part 3, so I'm only going to be judging it accordingly. The segment of this show is often praised, while its flaws may be overlooked or understated among fans. I believe JoJo's Bizarre Adventure up to part 3 falls victim to the anime bias. The storytelling in JoJo's is unconventional and stylish in ways I genuinely enjoy, but it seems like the writing is compromised in favor of communicating its identity clearly and quickly. But in part 3, the new power system called Stands replaces the previous one, Hammond, almost instantly. Within the first 5 episodes, we're flooded with new info and techniques, rather than a slow discovery of a new in-universe power. And that's fine, but this introduction doesn't seem like a natural evolution of the story, and instead feels like a shortcut so the author can start writing a new plot without having to dwell on any new info for too long. Another thing that struck me as rushed or basic was Jotaro's character. The archetype is simple and clear enough, a tall, stylish, handsome man who is cocky, selfish, and rude, but these traits are delivered through a path of least resistance. He calls his mother a bitch.
You bitch! You're such a bitch! Why are you such an annoying bitch?
He's often followed by a mob of girls who are in love with him, who he, of course, mistreats. The way these traits are communicated isn't nuanced or patient. They're upfront, shallow, and quick. There's little room to interpret what kind of person he is, and absolutely zero subtext. But the fans often mistake this shallow writing as being stylized. There's also unrealistic aspects. Of course, it's anime, and it's fiction, and it's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but the plane scene in part 3 is a good example of what I mean. The flight attendants serve to accentuate Jotaro's persona of being a woman magnet. The flight attendants don't really feel like real people. And then there's the people getting impaled through their head while no one on the plane bats an eye. There is no way no one would have woken up from this. Contrivances are employed to avoid dragging on the scene maybe, and it seemed like the author did not want to write about these people in the plane and sacrifice some realism to make the scene more focused. But doing this just makes the stakes feel less high. Part 3 is not the most praised part, and I'm aware that the show gets better progressively, but it still receives a significant acclaim from the community and is among the most iconic in the series. But why? Is it nostalgia? Is it masculine fantasy to adore Jotaro even with his shallow writing? Is it the entertainment quality of it, discarding some realism in favor of being more focused and interesting? Let's look at a few more examples. Alright, let's talk about Jujutsu Kaisen. So, Jujutsu Kaisen, in my mind, is pretty much the perfect first anime. It has interesting plot points, characters, and character arcs, and most of all, really awesome fight scenes. Up to where the anime is now, the characters are consistent for the most part, and they've received interesting development. But people also hype up this show a lot. Jujutsu Kaisen has some of the best modern animation, or just animation in general, and is seriously one of the most entertaining shows I've ever watched. I've seen a lot of video essays analyzing characters in Jujutsu Kaisen, and I can agree with most of them, and I honestly do think Jujutsu Kaisen is a really well written show, but there are clearly points where the writing or potential development is compromised or sacrificed entirely to create more hype battle sequences. Season 2 is absolutely infamous for having rushed animation. While I think the animation is amazing, there are parts that are noticeably less polished and more unfinished. It was never a huge issue to me though, other than the fact that it overworks poor MAPPA animators of course, until I read part of the manga. This fight, Makura vs Sukuna, takes an entire episode in the anime. It's around 6 or 7 minutes maybe, give or take, when trimmed down, but it spans the entire episode and encompasses a large amount of its runtime. Yes, it's a shonen anime, but this thing here, Makura, is a random beast that can be resummoned and is fighting Sukuna, the series' main villain, who I know isn't going to die here because that would be random and it would feel unearned for Sukuna to die at the hands of a random summon. The fight had absolutely no business being this long, and it's not like the stakes are really high either. But in the manga, the fight is only 1.5 chapters, and that's not an exaggeration. You can check for yourself if you want. I'm going to estimate that over half of the fight in the anime is completely anime only, and includes crazy sequences that would definitely take a lot of time to animate. This fight is not the only victim of this. The JoJo vs Sukuna fight was also much shorter in the manga. If these fights were as long as they were in the manga, the animators would have a lesser burden on their shoulders, and the plot wouldn't be as padded. It would still have cool fights, but it seems like the fights overstay their welcome in the anime compared to relatively more concise fights in the manga. But considering the manga is the source material, it also falls victim to compromising certain elements in favor of making cooler fight scenes. I have a great appreciation for Jujutsu Kaisen's tight writing and interwoven characters, but sometimes I don't feel fully immersed when the writing is compromised for the fight scenes. There's a lot of missed potential, like Toji for example. I will forever complain about how lame Toji's fateful end was. His character was so interesting and deeply connected to two of the characters, but then he just ends himself. It could have been way better, and I think if the fighting was less focused on, it might just have been improved. Here's one more example, possibly the most overhyped anime ever. Solo Leveling. Solo Leveling is based on a Korean webcomic. The difference between webcomics and serialized comics is that anyone can upload webcomics. This is great, there aren't any harsh deadlines or prerequisites to getting a work published, and it's really good to make the medium more accessible to create. But this also makes the medium super bloated, filled with mediocrity. It's a surprise that Solo Leveling was noticed. People say it's one of the best Korean webcomics to ever be released, but the thing is, it kind of sucks. Alright, that's a little bit harsh, but Solo Leveling seriously lacks so much character depth and has practically zero introspective qualities. There's almost no character development either. The conflicts aren't compelling from a lack of stakes. There's pacing issues, some inconsistencies, and overall the show is extremely formulaic. And here's the thing, even the community agrees that the writing is lacking. Anyway, Solo Leveling has little to... Wait, hold on. Let's go back for a second. The community agrees that the writing is lacking, but they still enjoy it? Interesting. Okay. Anyway, Solo Leveling has little to no character development, which the fanbase is aware of, and this... So, the fans admit that it's bad, but still like it? What's that about? They don't ignore its shortcomings, rather embrace it as part of the medium. But why? Pulp fantasy is a somewhat forgotten era of storytelling. Serialized in magazines typically made from cheap paper composed of wood pulp, pulp fiction or pulp fantasy were cheap stories made for exhausted workers before labor laws became strict, something to distract them. These stories, often completely indistinguishable from each other, were meant to serve one main purpose: entertainment. While it's true that some titles stood out, many of them relied on recycled plots, often including inconsistencies and shallow narrative. Though a niche community existed, and still exists, proclaiming these stories as carrying significant philosophical weight, their existential qualities and dark atmosphere were likely a product of surface-level concepts executed stylistically to the type of medium, rather than deliberate thought and depth. Was this random magazine really existential, or was it just overtly and shamelessly edgy? It's particularly interesting to look back now. Since times were different back then, you and I are somewhat removed from certain ideals at the time. Considering pulp fantasy is a completely dead genre, the often overused tropes might not be as well known to us when the extent of their usage is self-contained within the medium itself. Because these stories are different to the post-Tolkien era of fantasy, they seem particularly appealing and unique. Sound familiar? Because these stories are so different from Western media, they seem particularly appealing and unique. So, it's easy to look at pulp fantasy and just say it's cheap garbage that people like because it's entertaining. But there's more to it. People praise pulp fantasy, even when it's lackluster, because it's entertaining. They really like certain elements of the story, so they try to justify it by writing an embellished critique of it, applauding its writing and structure, when the ornateness of the writing is just a mask for the fact that they just like it. They just personally enjoy the medium. Countless people cite JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Parts 1 to 3 as immaculate fiction, same with Jujutsu Kaisen, and it's really easy to point out its obvious flaws. JoJo's treats you like you have no critical thinking skills, leaving little to no room for interpretation, and Jujutsu Kaisen's fight scenes are too long and sacrifice potential that the series had. But so? People like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure because it's bizarre. When fans struggle to articulate why a show resonates with them, they fall back on familiar superlatives that may be misleading. A masterclass in storytelling, a perfect 10 out of 10, an immaculate plot, an elaborate cast of characters and developments. But if you like JoJo's, which I do so far as well, you don't have to pressure yourself into judging it based on certain things. Yes, it's far too upfront sometimes, but it's also the only show where people can have full-on battles just by standing in one spot and letting a ghostly figure fight for them. Jujutsu Kaisen has a tightly woven story, but is also just interesting. People quote-unquote overrate these shows, but this overpraise is a mask for their genuine interest and appreciation of the show. Funny enough, Solo Leveling is actually really close to many conventions seen in pulp fantasy. Dungeon crawling adventures where a reluctant hero fights monsters and demons and gains more strength in doing so. And people really hate Solo Leveling, while other people say it has really good writing. Is it subjective? It undoubtedly does not have amazing or original writing, but its purpose is similar to the stories published in pulp magazines. I'm not equating Solo Leveling to slop. It's unoriginal, but that's kind of what you expect going in. It's a solid piece of fiction for what it's going for, and once again, people try to critique it based on standards that it isn't trying to live up to, just to justify the fact that they like it. If you're worried that you're overrating a show, just stop to make sure that you aren't praising it for the wrong reasons or reasons that don't make sense. Find out why you actually like the show. After watching Attack on Titan 6 times, I have a thorough appreciation of the stories, characters, and their development, as well as everything else. But the first time I watched it, I liked it because it was cool. ODM gear was unrealistic, but it was cool. Big and awesome looking humans fighting each other was also cool. The insane plot twists are seriously incredibly well written, but they're also just cool. Anime is weird, yes, but it's also cool. Cool seems like an immature word to use, but I wouldn't call it immature so much as I would call it humiliatingly honest. A brutal but necessary acceptance that yes, anime has shortcomings, and yes, anime is often praised for things that aren't true about it, but this praise is rooted in a genuine interest and appreciation. There are examples of people simply having less exposure to certain tropes and may be oblivious to the unoriginality, but the anime bias comes from people falsely identifying what they like in a series and giving them false labels. If you like a series that genuinely has awful writing or inconsistent characters, but you like it, and it genuinely brings you joy, then keep liking it. Fiction can be more than entertainment, sure, but it can also just be an expression of creative ideas. Fiction doesn't have to be heavy or sad, and people often mistake deeply tragic fiction as being superior, but liking something because it brings you genuine joy is a strong enough reason to praise it. Thank you all for watching this Peak Stasis video. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out my other content, and if you enjoy it, consider subscribing because I have more videos like this planned. Thank you all, and I'll see you in the next Peak Stasis video.